So I think we're live. So welcome to another talk at DDD. I hope everybody's been having a good time so far. I've been watching some great sessions, so I hope everybody enjoys this one. These are code of conduct, but I think everybody's seen this loads of times now since this is the last talk of the day. So just generally just be a decent person and keep the chat clean, really. Also, the donate to the National Museum of Computing. Yeah, I think these slides have already been covered loads of times, so there's the bit of link. So feel free to donate. There's also loads of great sponsors who are kind of sponsoring this event, and all the money is going to the Museum of Computing. And also, if anybody feels like tweeting out throughout the event and about this talk, feel free to use the hashtag or the @developerday. But that's pretty much it for the intro slides. I'll just get on to my talk, which is everything you need to know about the .NET configuration. But before that, I'm just going to say a bit about myself. So I'm just generally a software engineer. I like to get involved in architectural decisions, do a lot of cloud-based development stuff as well. I primarily write in C# and JavaScript. JavaScript these days is generally TypeScript, but I also dabble in lots of other kind of languages and like playing around with lots of other tools. I run two user groups, .NET York and .NET Chef. So one's in York and one's in Sheffield. And I also like to be kind of very highly involved in open source community as well. So I own some of my own open source projects, and I also contribute to other open source projects. So I've contributed to things like Mass Transit, Azure Functions, MongoDB driver, lots of other different things really. But if anybody wants to kind of reach out, best places to get me is like Twitter really. So just give me a tweet. But that's pretty much about me. So today we're going to try to cover the basics of kind of .NET configuration, how providers provide the data for the configuration, what the defaults are for if you're creating an ASP.NET website. We'll talk about kind of how data binding works between the configuration, and also then dependency injection, validation, and then we're going to look at what's new in the version 6 of it as well, which was released the other week with the new .NET 6. So let's go on about the basics. So there's a bunch of things we're not going to talk about inside .NET configuration. So .NET's been around a long time, and there's one thing what's been kind of holding that up with the .NET framework, and that's system.configuration. So that's the old kind of .NET configuration stuff. You can also get that at system.configuration configuration manager as a new package as well. So if you want to include that into your new .NET 6 application, that's possible. But I'd kind of avoid that. It's more for kind of migration. So if you kind of migrating your .NET framework application to the new .NET 6, you probably want to use that. There's also configuration manager, which is the really old .NET 2. Oh no, sorry, that's the .NET framework and .NET 2 version of it, which you can use, which is the old one as well. And then there's also configuration settings, which is the really, really old one of .NET Framework 1.0 and 1.1. So these are things we're not going to talk about. And these are things like the XML files, which look pretty ugly these days. So we're not going to talk about them. So what we are going to talk about are these new built kind of abstractions, what Microsoft have implemented. So this is Microsoft.extensions.configuration.abstractions. And there's also a bunch of other ones. So there's a login, caching, dependency injection, and localization. So these are a bunch of kind of abstractions and like API interfaces, what people can implement and create their own implementations of these. And one of these implementations is obviously the Microsoft version of the implementation. And this one's the Microsoft extensions configuration. And this is an implementation of them abstractions, but there's no reason why I couldn't come along with my Kevin.Smith .extensions configurations and implement them abstractions, or your company can do that as well. All the Microsoft extensions configurations are built on .NET Standard 2, so this means it works anywhere. This means it works on the .NET framework, so the old framework .NET, so that works on .NET 5 and 6, the .NET Core, Mono, Xamarin, Maui stuff, UWP, and also Unity. So if you ever want to use any configuration anywhere, you can pretty much just use the new configuration now. So as I said, it implements abstractions, the new Microsoft one. It can be downloaded by NuGet, like all the rest of the libraries these days. Has a concept of configuration providers, so that's where it gets its data feed from. One of them data feeds, what you can get from is an in-memory provider. And it has this kind of understanding that it can reload and update changes. So every time like a configuration provider says like some data's changed and that underlying kind of mechanism, it can tell the application to reload its changes. So we get configuration real time if you want to. And to be fair, the new configuration is probably one of the better things I've seen coming out of like the .NET since .NET Core really. Just because like there's been so many like horrible ways of doing configuration in .NET and other languages as well. And I think Microsoft took all the kind of bad concepts and good concepts from all the different languages and kind of combined them together in this just nice kind of library for everybody. So the configuration is just really a key value pair. So we have a bunch of keys, say key 1, and we can set that to value 1, key 2, and a value to key 2, etc. But we can also represent hierarchical structures by kind of using a colon as well. So we can do things like group our configuration together. So we might have our Twilio configuration, and that underneath it might have a base URI and an API key. And we also might have an environment configuration as well, and which is just at the root. And we might have features which actually has menu and a splash configuration to it. And these are kind of denoted with the colon. And so we can say Twilio colon base URI and pass it the string, and Twilio colon API key and pass the string as well. So everything is pretty much just key, which is a string, and a value, which is a string. But we can kind of denote some kind of hierarchical kind of structure to it as well by using colons. And this hierarchical structure can be unlimited all the way down a big massive tree. One of the things is that keys are case insensitive as well. So if you want a key which is case sensitive, that's not possible. So example high case will be the same as example low case. And if it's mixed case as well, like parent 1 and key 1, all the uppercase will be just exactly the same. So if you're trying to kind of get a key which is multi-case, that's just not going to work. It's just going to get the last one. So the basic code setup, you can create an in-memory configuration by just creating a dictionary and passing it to a configuration builder. So the configuration builder is how we kind of create a configuration. It has like a kind of fluid interface to it, so we can call this an add method to it, and we'll show you later down the line more of these. But this is just in-memory one, so we can just do an add in-memory collection and pass it our values, which are dictionary values, and call build. And this will give us a I configuration or I root configuration. And from that, we can get some values from it. So we can pretty much use the indexer to say, I want key 1, or you can say configuration, I want the parent 1 colon key 1, and it'll get them values for you. What other thing we can do is actually get sections as well. So because we've got it has understanding of this hierarchical structure, we can say, go get the parent 1, and then inside that parent 1, we can get the key 1 and key 2. So that makes it quite easy to pass things around. So if we've got our Twilio settings, we can just pass our Twilio settings into something what needs only them configuration settings. It also has this concept of reloads, as I said. And from a configuration object, after we built it, we can get a reload token. And we can register a callback for every time the reload, it's called the reload. So this is just calling console.writeLine and saying the configuration has changed. So if we call reload and force it to reload the configuration, it'll output the configuration change message. But then if we call it again, it does nothing. So after a reload has happened, you have to kind of re-register your callback if you want to kind of keep it up to date. So I'm just going to jump into a demo to kind of show that. One thing I said, didn't say at the start, if anybody's got any questions, feel free to drop them into Discord as well. I'm kind of monitoring that, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. So this is a small .NET 5 app actually, which has just a bunch of packages pulled in from NuGet. So we've got the configuration ones, some of the ones we're going to talk through later, but this is the current one for this demo. It's just the Microsoft extensions configuration. So the first demo is just the bunch of values what we've got here, and we've got this configuration builder. We pass the values into it, and then we call build. And I'm just going to show kind of output in. Pressing the right keyboard shortcuts. So this is going to build the configuration and then output key 1, parent 1, key 1, etc., and parent 1, key 2, which should be these values. So if you just jump over to my console app, if you just do a .NET run on here, we'll just see them values appear. So you've got value 1, value 2, and value 3, and that's come from these values here. So that's how you could just grab them values out of the configuration. The next example is just the sections. So that's just getting the first key. Oh, sorry, that's not that one. So that's getting the section of parent 1 and just outputting the key 1 from that parent. So that is going to be this one here, which should be just output as value 2. So if we just go from that, we'll just get value 2. So nice and simple, really. And the last one is just the reload change notifications. So if you want to come from that, we get a reload token. We can register a callback with it, which is just going to do a console write line saying the configuration has changed. We're going to call reload once, call it again, just to see the difference, really. If you go run that one, all we get is configuration change. So you can see it's only changed once, and after it's changed, we'd have to kind of go get the reload token again if you wanted to keep it up to date, and then register a callback from that as well. So if we just put that in there and run that, that'll give us 2 notifications that it's changed after we've done a reload. So very simple, really. Let's nip back to the slides. So we're going to talk a bit about configuration providers. So we've seen one already, and that's the in-memory one. But there's a bunch of other kind of providers, and you can also create your own as well. So there's ones which you can get information from files. So the common use ones is JSON. You can also get them from XML files and INI files. These are the built-in ones provided by Microsoft. There's also environment variable configuration. So any environment variables you can pull in, and also user secrets as well. But there's also a bunch of other ones what we point out cover. So these are command line configuration. So these are arguments coming in to your console app. There's Azure App Configuration, Azure Key Vault configuration. There's also loads of community provided ones like parameter stuff for AWS. There's also ones you can build your own as well. So there's like things like TOML and all sorts of other ones as well. So it's quite flexible, and you can pretty much just provide data from anywhere, really. So you could actually just go grab data from an API. So we've seen the in-memory one. It's fairly simple. So I'm not going to go over that again. The file provider one is a bunch of NuGet packages. So every single different type of file is a different NuGet packages. So we've got an INI, JSON, and XML one, which are provided by Microsoft. And they're all kind of using the same kind of underlying concept as well. So the file provider for them all is the same as before. We've got this fluent kind of builder pattern. So we call add INI file, add JSON file, and add XML file as methods on the configuration provider. So these are actually extension methods on top of here. And we pass in the actual file what we want to load from. So we've got app settings.ini, app settings.json, and XML. We've got a parameter which says it's optional. So if that file doesn't exist, it'll just skip over it and not bother kind of trying to load that. If that's set to false, the configuration builder will blow up when you call build. And then there's also the second argument here, which is actually reload on change. So this is kind of how the kind of reload stuff will actually probably work in reality compared to that example I gave before. So the providers have an ability to say when this file changes or something somewhere changes, it has the ability to kind of refresh the configuration. So if that's set to true, anytime this file is changed, it'll actually kind of just update your application's configuration. And if you set to false, it'll just get a static data for the rest of the application after the first build. So the ini provider one, if anybody's seen ini files, it's kind of a long time since lots of applications use these, but this is an example. So you can have a key which looks like this and a value after the equals. And you can also create sections as well. So we can actually have a section in brackets. So this says login level : log level. And then inside that section, it just comes with the keys as well, and then the values. And these really just get outputted to these kind of values here. So it takes this structured value and just flattens it into one key, which is just with our colons. So our sections here are just kind of separated by column. And then the values are just what the values are. The JSON file is just very similar. So instead of actually having subdocuments in the JSON file, they just get outputted as colons between them as well and flattened. So for example, this login log level default, we'll just get login log level in default here, and just duplicated ones for each key of that. The XML one, pretty much exactly the same as the JSON one, except for an XML. So the example is pretty much the same. So login log level default, we'll just end up with a big long key. The next one is environment variables. So these actually are a bit different. So these replace the colon in the keys with a double underscore. So your environment variable will have to be like Twilio __ API key, and that'll build it up into a kind of one with a colon in between it instead of the double underscores. And because most like environment variables are case insensitive on some platforms, that means you can, by default, it doesn't matter if you do uppercase or lowercase. So if you're using kind of bash defaults, if I were all your variables uppercase, your application will be able to just accept that by default anyway. And like the file providers, this is just another NuGet package as well. So this is an example of the environment variables, how to set up. So you just create a configuration builder and do an add environment variables. One thing you can pass into it as an optional parameter is the prefix. And this is good if you've got multiple products on your machine. So if you've got like 4 applications and you don't want all the environment variables mixed up with each other, you can prefix it with your product name, which is also good for security as well. So if there's a lot of kind of environment variables which are kind of secrets and things like that, you probably don't want your application loading all the actual secrets. So this is just a few examples of environment variables. So we're exporting a Twilio __ API key. This is like a bash example, and that'll just come to this example on the right hand side here. So that'll get flattened with a colon, and the value will be that. And then the PowerShell one is just another alternative. So just using env to set the environment variable instead. But this has got an example of like, it can be multi-case or uppercase, it doesn't really make any difference. Use secrets is a way for kind of just storing secrets against your application, which are pretty much your personal secrets. So these are things what you want to kind of like production secrets, they shouldn't be there, but these are your kind of personal kind of secrets which you want to run your application. And this is a way to kind of remove the problem of people committing their own user secrets into like the source control and then pushing them up into kind of Git. So these user secrets are kind of correlated by this user secret ID, and the user secret ID is hidden away in the CS project. So the CS project actually has the same user secret ID for everybody, but everybody has their own special file on their own machine in their user directory for actually storing the secrets. And the secrets are all just stored as a JSON file, so they're all actually just pure text. So they're not actually encrypted, so there's no ciphers in there. So if anybody wants to go in there and they have access to your machine, they can actually just see the secrets in the JSON file. And this is another NuGet package as well, like all the rest. So this is very similar to the JSON one because it's built on top of the JSON provider. So you call the add user secrets, you pass in the assembly name where you want it to get that the GUID for the user secret ID. So that was where the CS project is, so the assembly name. And you also have an optional and also a reload on change as well, exactly the same as the previous one. So you can either pass in the assembly or you can pass a type which is in the assembly to load it. And if you want to add configuration to your application for user secrets, which is just going to be locally, you can do a .NET user secret set, Twilio API key, and then the value. And the same thing for listing, removing, and clearing. And one of the last ones is you can actually load configuration from another configuration. So by default, Microsoft do this for the actual ASP.NET Core. So they actually load a bunch of configuration in and pass it then to another configuration builder. So you can just kind of take a bunch of configurations if you want to, what somebody else has built up, and then add them to your own builder and keep adding them over time. So this is just an example using links aggregate function. And one thing what does matter is the ordering, what you actually kind of build these up. So we have 3 in-memory collections here, all with the same key. So every single in-memory collection has a bunch of in-memory values with the same key of item. Well, they've all got different values of 1, 2, and 3. And it's always the last one wins. So if we try to do a console write line of configuration item, this will output 3. So what it does is go up the tree of kind of the configuration providers and says, can I find item in this configuration provider? And if not, it'll go to the next one and then to the next one until it finds it. So this is how you kind of override if you've got like a JSON provider and another provider, like the environment variable provider, you can just override all your configuration with environment variables, which is really useful. One thing is quite good to know about is you can actually get a debug view of all your configuration. So because you might end up loading from like a JSON file, like command line arguments to environment variables, or even your kind of user secrets, you might get that confused where kind of configurations come from. But if you get an instance of your I configuration from somewhere, so usually your ISA container, or as soon as you build the configuration, you can call this method called getDebugView, and this will give you a blob of string which actually represents kind of where all the values are coming from. So these are the keys from your configuration, and also then it'll say the value of what it's actually got, and it'll tell you the configuration provider, where it came from, and if the configuration provider has some settings about it where you've set, so it'll come up with a configuration provider like this anyone and say it's any configuration provider for app settings.any, and also tell you if it's like optional as well, which is really useful if you're trying to diagnose kind of where some settings are coming from. So I'm just going to take a bit of a demo for that one as well. Yeah, so somebody's asked the question about the configuration provider in your own code. Yeah, I'll go into that in a bit actually. So I'm going to touch on the ASP.NET Core kind of defaults and things as well. But if I don't kind of answer that in the next section, feel free to kind of question some more. So the next demo is just showing you examples of configuration providers. So we kind of add a JSON file, which is our app settings. We say it's not optional and it can reload. And I've added some user secrets and some environment variables. So if you go have a look at our app settings, we've got a key 1, section 1, and key 2 inside that. So what we're going to do is just play around this key 1 for the time being. So it's just going to go around a while loop and keep writing out key 1 and delay by 2 seconds. So if we go run that now, let's go clear this. This will just keep coming up saying here's the value every 2 seconds. But if we go change this app settings here to I've changed the value, you'll see straight away that it should update the actual output of this application. So I've not had to stop this application or change it pretty much anything. It's just picked up that change, and I can change it again to anything I like, and it should pick up that change straight away. Pretty cool. So if we go change this key one to be set in our environment variable instead. So if you just do a $env and set this to env bar, and then we can just go run the application again. And you'll see that that configuration just comes straight from the environment variables configuration instead. Good. So this is happening because we've got this add environment variables at the bottom here, and the add JSON file is at the start. So this one takes precedence of the JSON file. So it allows us to overwrite configuration. And the last one is just the user settings. So if we go look into the CS project over here, this has a app user secrets ID, which is this big GUID. So if we could drop into the console again and just do .NET user secrets list, and that's right. Yeah, so there's no user secrets added for this application. So I think it's add key. What's there? Let's add hint. The right thing. Other things are set on here as well. It's set actually, my bad. So we can do a set int 4, and then it's saved into 4 over here. So if we do a .NET run again, we'll see that comes up. Oh, sorry, my bad. Let's go update the application. So if we change this to say int instead, do a .NET run, this will take my user secrets instead, which is 4. And the value over in here, this app settings of int of 12, you won't be able to kind of be loaded because this is overriding it. But if I go clear the user secrets, clear the screen, and then run it again, we'll get the value of 12 coming out because now we haven't got any user secret set, so they're not overriding the app settings JSON. So that's the demo for the providers. So I'm saying they've got blurry content from the screen. I'll try to zoom in more. So I'm just going to talk about the web host default. So somebody mentioned this in the chat on Discord as well. So this is kind of a bunch of kind of default configuration set up for ASP.NET Core applications. And they kind of had this in the, I think it was .NET Core 2, I think it was, where they introduced the previous version to that. It was just hard coded in the template for you, and you could change it around. But now it's kind of baked into the actual framework. So you probably got a CS project that looks like this within .NET Core 3.1 and .NET 5. .NET 6 has changed a bit, but you do still have this host builder, which creates the default builder. So you'll have something which is similar to this in your application, which creates some defaults. And what it does under the hood, it's already got an I configuration, and it adds that to your configuration for your web application. So it's got a bunch of settings in there, which it uses itself for starting up. It then appends just a normal app settings.json file. And then the next it appends an app settings and environment variable, your environments.json. So anything which is inside of ASP.NET Core _environment variable, it'll use to put in this space here for the environment. So if you've got like a production app, you'll have app settings.production.json, and for development, you'll have an app settings.development.json, and you can create your own environment names as well. It's just anything which is actually set on this variable. There's actually 2 variables. There's this one, which is normally the default, but then you also have a .NET environment as well. So if this one's the ASP.NET Core one's not set, it takes the .NET environment instead. It then adds app secrets like we've shown before, and this only adds app secrets in development environments. So if you're running it locally, it adds app secrets, but if you're running it in production, it won't add them because they're only used for kind of development purposes. And then it also adds environment variables at the end one. So environment variables will take precedence over the app settings and the app setting environment variables. So that's how it's quite common for people to create containers and plumb in the environment variables to override things when it changes environments. The other alternative is to use like app settings.json as a baseline for your kind of settings, and then also then override certain elements of your configuration with the app settings.environment.json with your production, testing, etc. environment variables. So I hope that answered that question in the chat. But if not, please feel free to post in the comment. So I'm just going to go over kind of options and bindings. So what we've seen so far is a bunch of like kind of raw keys and values and being able to kind of like go get a section of that configuration. But what we really want to do is kind of get the kind of configuration as a nicely typed object. So we want to take our configuration data, which is just a bunch of key and values, which is all strings, and we want to map these to some kind of structure which actually is like strongly typed and represents some kind of options within our code. So we want it to be able to represent a string, what we've got already, really. You also want to represent an int, longs, girids, date times, and data time spans as well, and also be able to represent other complex structures. So this is where kind of binding comes into play. And the binding kind of package is actually kind of implemented on top of the abstractions. So when we first started this talk, we said that there's a Microsoft extensions configuration implementation of the abstractions. And the binding framework is actually only an implementation on top of the abstraction. So if you've come in and actually created your own implementation of the configuration abstractions, the bindings will still continue working, which is quite cool. So the bindings are inside of Microsoft extensions.configuration.binding, but as I said, you can also kind of apply them to any or other kind of configurations which you kind of provide as well as an implementation. So option pattern is kind of the recommended way to access configuration. It's strongly typed. I think it's supposed to be able to support records soon, but kind of the current records, unless you've got getters and setters on all your records, it won't work. It adheres to kind of good software engineering principles such as interface segregation principle, so segregating parts of your kind of application up based on what it needs, and also the separation concerns as well. So these are a couple of examples of how to get data by binding stuff together instead. So we've got this is an example of just adding the in-memory collection, and this time we've got a GUID, which is a string. And if you want to get that after the configuration is built, we can just do a get value and pass in the type argument here, which is in a generic, and then pass in the key. And this will give us back an actual GUID, what is converted from this string. Other ways to kind of get this as well. So we can also use the bind method. And also pass it an object. So that the first one is just fundamental types. So if you're trying to get an int, long, double, decimal, etc. If you want to bind to a complex object, we can do that. So we've got this example options, which actually has an int and a GUID on it. And our dictionary of values for our in memory has just got an int and GUID, and they're just representative strings as well still. And what we do is create our options class, and then we can just do configuration.bind and then pass in our options class. And this will take all the stuff which is in here and bind it straight to this model. The next example is very similar as well. And this is just so we can actually bind to a hierarchical kind of configuration. So this has got a kind of parent of an example and then got a key of int and GUID. So very similar to before. Our example options is not changed at all. It's just exactly the same. We can pass it, create a new options class, and then we can just pass in the kind of root of where we want to kind of bind from. So we're saying we want to bind from the key of example, and anything under that will just bind directly to it. So the int and the GUID will bind straight to this model. And then there's one last one, which you can use a get method. So once you've got a section, similar to the other one, instead of actually just creating our own example options, we can just get a section, call get on it, and then pass it the type where we want to get, and it'll bind directly to it. So that's pretty much the basics of kind of the binding stuff, but you don't usually kind of use the binding on its own. You kind of use it with the dependency injection as well. So this is probably what people are most likely using today with ASP.NET Core, unless you're just hand rolling your own console application. So you've probably seen this kind of style before, where you do services.configure. You pass in your options class, so where you want to kind of bind it to, and you pass in your configuration object. And you can also pass in your section as well, so you can do get section and then give it the section name you want to. So this is using the .configure extension method on the services. So that's using the ASP.NET Core in the start of configuration stuff. And then if you want to kind of hand roll it, as you said, you can totally do this. So you can create a service collection instead. So this is as if you want to kind of use the kind of IOC container within inside of the Microsoft DI framework. We can create our configuration builder like we did before, and then we can just call .configure on it exactly the same within inside ASP.NET Core. One thing this does require though is it's got NuGet packages to bind all these together, which is already part of like kind of the SDK for ASP.NET Core. And this is Microsoft.extensions.options.configuration.extensions, and this gives you these methods here which you can use. So once you've registered that, it gives you a kind of a bunch of stuff under the hood. So it gives you a IOptions factory and iConfiguration options, and iConfigure named options, and iPost configuration options, and also gives you an IOptions of your type of options, a snapshot version of it, and a monitor version of it, and a cache version of it. These up here are really useful if you want to kind of reconfigure your configurations after it's loaded. So there's ways to kind of plumb into kind of after it's bound all your kind of configuration, you can then kind of configure your configuration based on your needs. And I've used this post configuration options before, where I've took a kind of other third-party library. It's got its own kind of way of configuring stuff, what it loads from a certain file. And if you want to kind of reconfigure it based on your own needs in code, you can just use the iConfiguration options and create an implementation of that. But the ones we're just going to go over are these three down here, which is probably the most common use case ones. So the IOptions of T options. So this is your own type of configuration, what you want to bind to. It's going to be registered as a singleton, and it reads the configuration at the app startup, and then it's going to use that configuration for the rest of the time of the application. So if you've got a configuration provider which has on change stuff, so if it can reload configuration on change, if you bind to if you use an IOptions of your T options, then you won't get that actually changed. So if they're changing the JSON file, the configuration is not going to change. It's going to be the same one from the apps when the app started. It also supports name configuration options as well. So there's a way to kind of, if you have two different, like if you're using two different Twilio accounts with different API keys, you can still bind to the same typed object, but just give them a name instead. Second one is an IOptions snapshot, and this is registered as a scoped lifetime. So every single time a scope in your IC container is created, it reads the configuration data on every single new scope, and then it's the same kind of IOptions snapshot all the way through that single kind of scope. So a scope is usually tied to like an ASP.NET Core request. So every time a HTTP request comes in, it'll load the configuration, and then it'll get the same state all the way through that request, and then the next request will have a different state. So this allows you to kind of change your configurations at runtime, but not be affected by it changing over a kind of request for kind of a user request. So they both implement the same kind of a similar interface. So there's a interface of IOptions of T-options, and then the IOptions snapshot actually implements in the IOptions as well. So they're interchangeable. So this is kind of how you'd kind of implement it. So we've got our kind of class. It could be one of your services or kind of your controller. We kind of plumb in one of these IOptions snapshots for my type, which is my app options. And then every time I want to kind of load that, I call it dot value of it, property of it, and then I can go load my kind of property off of it. And I'll show an example of that in a minute. The other kind of one is an IOptions monitor. So this allows you to kind of listen to change notifications in your application and then also get the current state of the values of them configurations. So once you've kind of registered, injected an IOptions monitor into your class, you can then call an onChange function, which takes another callback. This is supposed to be an arrow function here. I don't know why that's disappeared. It takes a callback, and it can just writes it to the console of whatever it's changed to. And you can also get the current value of the current state as well. So outside of the kind of onChange event, so if you don't want to kind of, for example, if you've got like a thick client and you want to post like every time something happens when some of the configuration changes, you could just pop a message saying like, oh, the configuration has changed of this application. Do you want to refresh? And you can click yes or something. And that's kind of how that could work. But you kind of get the current value as well. So I'm going to do a quick demo of that. So I've not got long left, and I've got a few more bits and bobs to go through. So this is our demo 3. So we're creating a service collection. We've got our configuration builder. We add our configuration file here, and we've got reload on change added. We're adding some transient dependencies into our service collection as well as our configuration. So this is the main part 1 here. This configuration options is just an int in the GUID, we've seen before, and then we've just got a while forever loop here, which is delaying every 1 second, and just calling. Let's just execute the first app, not the second one. So we're going to get the service of demo 1 app 1, and we call it execute on it. I'm just going to take a look at this one. So this is the one with the snapshot one. So if I just change that to IOptions, run through this the other day, and I didn't change it back. So this is taking an IOptions into it of a certain type, which is my example options what registered, and it's just going to keep executing them and keep printing out the current value of the int. And this is coming from here. So we've got the int value of 12 on here. So if we just go run that, make sure I've saved all the files. So what this is going to do is keep printing out 12 every single time, and that's totally fine. If we go change the actual app settings, and we go change this to, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and save it, as you can see, it's still like print out 12 because it's using just that I snapshot. So what we can do is just go back to our example and change this to IOptions snapshot of T. And we don't need to actually put it into any other variable because this is an IOptions snapshot implements an IOptions. So none of our code needs to change. So we can run back our application again. As you see, we'll get a new value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But now if you go change that app settings JSON file and just put a load of 1 in there and save it, you'll get the change straight away, because every time we get a new scope, what we're creating this class from, we'll get a new updated value. So the next demo is just one of the change load notifications. So this is this one. So this is creating another demo app. So this is demo 3 app 2, and then just calling execute on it. So it's doing pretty much the same thing, creating it from the ISA container and just calling execute. What this one does though is it injects an IOptions monitor of T, which is our example options again. It's getting the same int value every single time, so it's calling options.int, gets the current value, which is here. And then it also registers an onChange callback, which actually prints out new int value and then prints out the new int value what it's actually changed to. So if you just go run that quickly, this is coming out of 1111. So if we go change that to 2222 and save that, what we'll get is, before it disappears, we'll get a bunch of notifications what says what it's changed to. So we've got a new int value 2222, and this is our callback being called. And why this has got like repeated multiple times, and that's because it's just going around in a for loop every single time. So we're getting multiple callbacks on this IOptions every single time this is changed, and it's not dissociating them with it. So that allows us to kind of get notifications when our configuration changes, and gets configuration changes no matter what configuration provider as well. So if you was using, say, Azure Key Vault, and then keys change, you would get a notification from that. Or if the JSON file changed or the XML file changed, it would all work exactly the same under the hood. So. Yeah, so like, yeah, so somebody just asked a question in the chat about kind of you don't really care about the configuration option. You don't. Yeah, so you don't really need to care about the kind of I configuration kind of object after you've kind of the configurations build. If you're just using all the kind of stuff built into the DI container, you'll just kind of bind everything to your own typed objects. But sometimes you might not want to do that. So if you've got some kind of where you've got pretty much like just one key and one value, you might not want to bother binding that to some kind of object in the DI container. You might want to just go grab that from the iConfiguration object and just plumb that straight into another class if that's more appropriate. But it's pretty much up for grabs kind of how you kind of use that. So there's one last thing to kind of cover, and that's validation. So there's actually ways to kind of validate kind of your configuration after it's loaded, and it throws, after you get the configuration, it can throw an exception, and this is an options validation exception. So there's three ways to do it. So there's data annotations, which are very common, especially if people are using ASP.NET Core to kind of validate their models coming in from the HP. There's also inline validation callbacks as well, and also you can implement an I validation options of T if you've got some kind of complex validation what you want to do as well. So these are kind of examples of it. So you can do an add options of T, which are with the type of your options what you want to plumb in. You can bind the configuration, then you can just call a validate data annotations, and then we can just put our normal data annotations, what people are most likely used to. So this is just a regex one, and this is just a range saying this int needs to be in the range of 18 to 100. There's also kind of inline validation, so we can just give it a delegate as well. So this just says go validate these options where the age is greater than 18. And then the last one is where we kind of just add like a implementation of this I validation options interface, and we just add that as a singleton. And what that'll do is just match up every time it validates this app options, where it'll just create this, it'll just run through this validate method here, and then run whatever code you want to kind of run. So if you've got some kind of a complex validation logic you want to do, it can just run that for you. So this is kind of an example kind of how you'd use it in your application. So this is similar to our kind of other kind of demos. We've got an execute method. We also kind of call this .value to get the IOptions. So this is using the IOptions snapshot as before. And as soon as we call the .value, it'll run the validation. And if that fails, we'll get an exception. We can catch that exception, and then we can go look through the failures and why it failed. If it's successful, it just goes on to the next line and prints out the name and the age. So yeah, I've got a short example of that one. And then we can wrap up after that. So this is binding to in-memory. So we've got a service collection was before, we've got a configuration, what we built with the configuration provider, of in-memory configuration provider, sorry. And then we're adding our options, we're calling bind on it, and then we're just adding a transient validator app again, and then we're just kind of calling execute. So this is a bit more simpler. And inside that, it's just got that bit of code what you saw on that slide. So if I just run that just to show you what it does without any validation, it'll just say hello Kevin and then print out an age, which is this method here. So what we can do is go add the validation data annotations to it. So these annotations are on this value. So this says it has to be an age of 18 to 100 with a regex with only letters for the names. So if we run that, that'll still work perfectly fine and validate and print it out. But what we can do is then just go change our age. I can just put myself as 11 for the time being. And now if we go run that, it'll then throw that validation exception. So now we've got this exception, which is printing out the problem. So it says data annotation validation fail for member's age with the error value for age must be between 18 and 100. So you get a nice useful error message with that. And the same thing for the regex. So if I change my name to be a bunch of numbers and then run that as well, we'll get add two validation errors. One was complaining about my name and then saying it doesn't match the regex, one with the age. So if we just uncomment that, we can comment out the validation. This is just the delegate callback. And if we run that, we'll get exactly the same error again, but we don't get because it's a delegate, we don't actually get any kind of understanding of what was incorrect when it validated it. So what it can do is just print out a validation error as occurred. And that's my last demo. Then last thing to cover is what's new in version 6. So with .NET 6 being released, they have shipped another version of this. So it is just version 6 on NuGet. It doesn't require .NET 6. It is still .NET Standard 2.0. So you can use it in the old .NET framework if you want to. And there's only really one kind of difference. And then the new kind of ASP.NET Core is now using, instead of using a configuration builder, and then on that configuration builder, you get configuration root when you call build. So these are the current things what we're using .NET 5 or the older version of this. We now got this configuration manager, so kind of the manager class. And this kind of encompasses both of these classes into one. So that instead of the two things being two different interfaces of an iConfiguration builder and iConfiguration root, we've got these a configuration manager, which is an iConfiguration builder and is an iConfiguration root. And that means you can, instead of creating a configuration builder, which builds a configuration root, we just use a configuration manager. And every single time you add a new configuration source, it'll rebuild itself. So it's usable straight away. And there's kind of caveats to both of these. So once this is built once, you can't really change it, and it's quite expensive to rebuild, as this is less expensive to kind of rebuild because it knows how to rebuild itself without actually kind of rebuilding the whole configuration root again. So it's worth to note that going forward, we'll probably be using the configuration manager inside the new version of 6, but I don't want to write them all down using the configuration manager in this talk in case anybody else is using the kind of older stuff. All right, so a bit of summary before we wrap up. We've got like 5 minutes for the chat if anybody wants it. So we've just gone over the providers, and that's kind of how we get data into the configuration. We're going over the web host defaults for ASP.NET Core, and they've not changed for .NET 6 either. We're going over the bindings of kind of how we bind to complex objects. and how that plumbs into the dependency injection, and also how we can validate them as well. So in case we need certain properties for our configuration ready at runtime, we can also validate them. So there's lots of kind of information out there. There's just the main ones, which is the .NET configuration on the Microsoft website, and also the options pattern, which is probably worth a good read as well. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for kind of attending my talk, and I hope everybody's kind of had a good DD so far. I'll hang around in the chats to kind of answer any more questions if anybody's got any, but thanks again for kind of attending this talk.
Right, if you're okay, then I'll stop the live stream and we can swap over to Discord for any chats that go on. Okay?
Yeah, cool. That's great. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Richard.